It was January 2024. I was minding my own business when suddenly... Or in other words, an autistic hyperfixation with Sonic the Hedgehog I haven't had since high school came back. I'll get into the specifics when I cover those games, but even that aside, I've had a very SEGA-focused gaming year, what with all the amazing Atlas RPGs. But a quick disclaimer, one of those RPGs, Metaphor ReFantazio, will be getting its own full video later, so I will only be briefly touching on it here. I will just say that it is my game of the year in most categories. But my year actually started with... a non-Atlas SEGA RPG, Yakuza Like a Dragon. This is actually what caused the Sonic brain rot, but more on that later. This is a game I had my eye on for a while for two reasons. First, I saw Lady Virgilia stream Yakuza 0 and the series looked very fun. Secondly, this is the 7th installment in a long-running series, and it changed the core combat system from action to a turn-based RPG, and received wild critical acclaim from both Yakuza fans and critics. So hey, all of you out there saying turn-based RPGs are dead, I believe this is what we call a checkmate! Thanks to Steam Black Friday sales last year, I was finally able to pick it up. And did I enjoy it? Yeah, a lot. Now, like I said, this is the 7th game in a long-running series, but it stars a new protagonist and feels like a soft reboot. So I wasn't too confused jumping in. I will note though that the later half of the story does bring back a lot of old Yakuza characters and do some very big things to the overall status quo that will hit harder if you're familiar with the series history, but they're done in a way that doesn't undercut or overshadow Ichiban's solo journey. And what a journey this is. Starting my year with this was a bit of a shock to the system because, even I'll admit, most of the games I played in 2023 were not particularly story-heavy, while here I got a deeply, deeply emotional narrative driven by some incredibly strong performances. This is the first Yakuza to have an English dub in a while, and it's very good. I especially have to praise Kaiji Tang. I hear him in a lot of games, and I'll admit his performances often blur together in my mind. He absolutely embodies Ichiban, to the point where I can't even acknowledge it as acting. And as for the character itself, well, I sum up Ichiban with that if anything ever happened to him, I would unalive everyone in this room and then myself meme. The other characters are great too. If you wanted a Persona game with adults, this is pretty much it. Or to put it another way, if you're sick of the basic character tropes that show up again and again in even the best JRPGs, you'll find this party refreshingly original. Technically these characters are still tropes, but they're crime drama tropes rather than JRPG ones. And it's refreshing seeing the game mechanics and structures we JRPG fans love applied to different genres. I won't go further into the story because it's best experienced for yourself, but I will say, the way they cut to the credits in the final scene left me practically screaming. It was that good. But let's talk about that actual JRPG gameplay for a moment, because I have an interesting perspective coming into this as a JRPG fan rather than a Yakuza fan. It all plays very well. A robust and fun turn-based battle system with some skill customization via classes. But if you're experienced with the genre, you'll probably find it very easy. There are extra difficulty modes, but they're New Game Plus only. I can't blame them for doing this, since they needed to make the game accessible to people who only played the action-based earlier installments. There's two gripes I have with the battle system. Firstly, both the party and enemies fidget and move around the battlefield constantly outside of your control. This, combined with there being no visual indicator of area effect on attacks, means you often won't hit what you're aiming at through no fault of your own. Apparently this is a lot better in Infinite Wealth. Secondly is the job system. Although it's billed as an important part of the gameplay, and I love how you get them via literal job applications at a recruiting agent, it doesn't unlock until over 10 hours by estimate into the game, and it's also very lopsided. Some characters' default jobs are nearly worthless, while others' defaults are so good you never want to reclass them. Again, I've heard Infinite Wealth balances the job system better. But story and combat aren't the only thing you're paying for in a Yakuza game. One of its trademarks is balancing wacky, off-the-wall humor with, I'll just say the meme, serious crime drama. It reminds me a little of Ace Attorney in that regard. The difference is the way that Yakuza separates the two tones. The main story is almost entirely serious, while the side quests are absolutely balls to the wall insane. There's a quest where you fight a giant Roomba, and that's one of the least weird ones. Yakuza is also the only franchise I know of to use quest rewards as a punchline, and this is best experience for yourself. But a lot of these are new employees for the business management minigame. Yes, there is a fully fledged business sim in this. Yakuza games are insane in how much content they have packed in. There's that, a full kart racing game, mahjong, shogi, poker, koi, and a very fun driving game where you collect cans for homeless people. There are hundreds of hours of content in this and any other Yakuza game, and they often go on sale on Steam for less than $10. That's how much I got Like a Dragon for. Easily the best value for money I've had this year. I gave this game a 4.5 out of 5 stars on my backlogged, and the only reason it's missing half is because of the other JRPGs I played this year. Speaking of which, I'm sure you've all been waiting for this one, so my thoughts on Persona 3 Reload. Well, firstly, I streamed it all on YouTube, over 100 hours of it, and had a lot of fun. Those VODs are on my channel if you want to see them, I highly recommend them. Also, I did a post-reload podcast with Lady Virgilia and Bubble Tea over on her channel, and most of my thoughts on the game can be found there. But to sum up, P3 Reloads had such a weird history this year. Near unanimously praised at first, but as the months rolled on, opinion shifted to mixed leaning negative. At least among all the die-hard Persona 3 fans I know. But as a member of that group myself, I still like this remake quite a lot, and that's because the things I wanted fixed got fixed. The reason I had always wanted a remake was because of the very obtuse social link system for anybody coming into the series from 4 or 5. And Reload marked the social links on the map, made it clear when your visits would result in a rank up, removed the reverse timer and jealousy, and added platonic routes for the girls. Literally everything I wanted. The social links themselves aren't altered that much from the original, including ones like Kenji and Maya that might come across as problematic today. But perhaps the thing that I love most is full voice acting for all 10 ranks of every social link. This became especially noticeable when playing Metaphor, which admittedly was in development before Reload started, but it is jarring to go back to the middle ranks being unvoiced after Reload. And while the rearrangements of old tracks are hit and miss, the new songs are all incredible, especially Color Your Night. And despite some minor tweaks to Yukari's attitude in the early parts of the story, I do think the narrative is still as strong as it was before, perhaps even stronger due to performances like Zeno Robinson as Junpei. You are this year's Best Performance award in my heart. The main point of contention seems to be the Tartarus and battle gameplay, which many existing Persona 3 fans found way too easy and possibly even outright mindless. Now, I've only experienced the game via live streaming every moment, so I'm not the greatest authority on this. I still think it's enjoyable, and I find its Merciless to be better than Persona 5's Merciless at least, which actually made the game easier. There's also a good number of totally new skills, like not even ones imported from Persona 4 and 5, skills that have never been in a Persona game before, like Auto Tarukabellion. In particular, there's a lot of depth to the skills on equipment in this game, perhaps even more than the original Persona 3. And even though some of the party members are different to how they played before, talking with more who played the game has shown me that the balance is actually decent, and definitely better than the original. Yes, it's not as difficult as Fess, but... and a lot of people are gonna dislike me saying this, but I feel like if you are an Atlus veteran, you're not supposed to go to Persona for difficulty. You're supposed to go to games like mainline SMT and Metaphor. In fact, Hashino made this clear when he said in interviews that he specifically made Metaphor difficult. Though I will say, even if they might not be the hardest Atlus bosses, Strega no longer falls over to a faint breeze, and this is incredible. They actually feel like climactic story points now. On the more neutral end, I am mixed on Link episodes. I think many characters who got these didn't need them. Really, only Ken's and Shinjiro's enhanced the experience, and Shinjiro's more enhanced Mitsuru than it did him in my opinion. It's so weird that it took until now for Mitsuru and him to feel like they were actually friends. My personal biggest negative with this game is the removal of the tired and sick system, which I thought was a huge part of the resource and time management gameplay of Tartarus. They try to replace it with SP management and needing to balance your Twilight fragments between healing and opening chests. It's just not quite the same to that whole risk factor of, do I go in while I'm tired and potentially get crit more often, or do I cut my losses and go home? In general, Reload is a great way to introduce my favourite JRPG to a new generation, and I don't dislike it as much as many other P3 fans do. I still give it a 4.5 out of 5 due to a couple of gripes. Okay, I apologise, but now it's time for Sonic BRAINROT. In short, I found a CD for Open Your Heart in Yakuza Like a Dragon, which got me to rewatch an old Sonic Adventure Let's Play, which got me to discover Frontiers, and the rest is history. But this came at a decent time. In my opinion, the notoriously inconsistent Sonic franchise is actually in a good place right now. Between the success of Frontiers and Shadow Generations, the movies being surprisingly good, the Twitter takeovers being fun and characterful, and the IDW comics, given this is Sonic, all I can say is please don't screw it up, but for now, pretty good. Technically, Frontiers was the first Sonic game I played this year, but it took me a while to finish it, and it's so built on the legacy of the franchise that I need to talk about the other games it brainrotted me into playing first. Starting with... he's dead. The Murder of Sonic the Hedgehog is a Sonic the Hedgehog mystery visual novel, I can't believe I'm actually saying that sentence, that came out in 2023 as an April Fool's joke for free. All of that sounds horrifying, I know. And perhaps the most horrifying thing? It's genuinely good. Not just good, it is the highest rated Sonic game on Steam by a very wide margin. Now, I'm only going to show the very intro of this, because it's only about 2 hours and it's free. You have no excuse not to play it yourself. But it's actually a great introduction to new fans as to what makes Sonic special to so many people. When these characters are written well, they are amazing. And this is the best writing these characters have had in over a decade. I'm not even joking. Everyone is great, but the real standouts are Amy and Shadow, Two characters with an up till this point very iffy writing history. Murder of Sonic Amy is how Amy should always be written. And I would say the same for Shadow were it not for the fact that Dark Beginnings and Shadow Generations handled him even better. But this game still deserves praise for being the first time Shadow was actually good in, again, like 10 years. To say any more would spoil the actually not bad story, but as a connoisseur of mystery visual novels, I do need to give a bit of criticism here. This is a good Sonic story, it's not the best mystery, and the reason for that is kinda weird. Tails, Sonic's best friend and the smartest member of the group, is the detective, but he's not the player character. You instead play as an intern who has no experience with the Sonic cast at all and is just an ordinary civilian. Why does this matter? Well, Tails is both significantly smarter than the Viewpoint character and is friends with the entire cast. That means he is always several leaps of logic ahead of your Viewpoint character, and this can be frustrating. The majority of the gameplay consists of pointing out evidence that's your only option at the time, playing a minigame to connect the dots, and then watching Tails explain everything for you because he's the only one with the knowledge and context to do so. The intern is not a bad character and they have a pretty nice arc, and I like the mundane viewpoint they provide, showing just how crazy this cast is from an outside perspective, but as I said, don't expect an Ace Attorney tier mystery here. Still though, if you have any interest in the Sonic cast, play this game, you have no reason not to, it's free and only 2 hours. I give it a 4 out of 5. While Murder was meant to be an introduction to Sonic stories and characters, the next game I played was meant to be an introduction to Sonic gameplay, at least on the classic side. Sonic Origins Plus. Now, this is a very weird game for me to rate, because opinions on this collection online are very negative, and people are understandably mad that they delisted the originals when it came out. I had a more positive experience for a few reasons. One, I never played the originals, so I have no frame of reference on how they're supposed to play. Two, I got this on sale, including all the Plus DLC, which is how I recommend getting this. Don't pay full price for it. And 3, I got this after, apparently, multiple patches improved the game significantly. It always makes me feel guilty reviewing a game in this state because I really don't want to encourage the mentality of, let's just fix it in post with patches. But at the same time, I'm playing the version of the game that works much, much better because of patches. Another thing to note is that, frankly, if you played the originals, you are not the target audience for Origins. The intent behind Origins was to give the influx of new fans from the movies a way to experience the original games easily. And I'd heard these games get a lot of praise, but I never played a Sonic game before Adventure 2 Battle, so now's as good a time as any to check them out. I'm going to be reviewing every one of the games in this collection on its own, and there's actually 4 of them, not just Sonic 1, 2, and 3, but also CD. I'll start with Sonic 1, and I'm so sorry Sonic fanbase, but I give this a 2 out of 5, and it's probably the worst game I played this year. So, here's the thing about Sonic 1. Green Hill Zone is amazing. They clearly put most of their effort into this level. It's the perfect way to show off the cool new platform protagonist SEGA made to compete with Mario. It has branching paths, loops, wide open areas to go fast, enemies you can chain bounces on, and get crazy momentum. The perfect environment for Sonic. And then somebody thought, what if, for level 2, we decide to throw him into the worst possible environment for Sonic? Small, cramped dungeon rooms, ceiling traps that literally force you to wait, even speedruns have to wait for some of them, and nearly unskippable rides on slow blocks through rivers of lava. Essentially, it's putting Sonic into a Zelda 2 dungeon. And the rest of the mid-game isn't much better. Spring Yard isn't terrible, but it's far from Green Hill. There's still a lot of waiting for moving platforms, and spikes positioned right in the middle of places you'd otherwise be able to go fast. And then there's the infamous Labyrinth Zone, which is not only another slow-paced puzzle level, but is also almost entirely underwater, and we know how Sonic deals with that. In fact, in some continuities, Labyrinth Zone was the cause of Sonic's aquaphobia in canon. But then we have one bright spot, Starlight Zone, the only other zone in the game to feel like what would later become Sonic style. And then Scrap Brain Zone is better than most, but okay, but it ends with a literal rehash of Labyrinth Zone. And a final boss that's just Eggman and a bunch of pistons. Any Sonic fans know that very little of Sonic 1 gets referenced later in the series except Green Hill. When it's kind of the only good level in the game, maybe there's a good reason for that. Fortunately, the other games in this collection show that SEGA clearly looked at Sonic 1, realized what worked, and did more of that. In the hit sequel, Sonic to CD? Yeah, CD canonically takes place before Sonic 2 in the timeline now, so I have to discuss that next. Sonic CD is a very strange game to me. Subjectively, it's my favourite of this collection. There's just something almost beautiful about the design of the levels, the almost surrealist art style, the absolutely incredible soundtrack in both Japanese and American. You can switch between them in this collection, though I prefer Japanese. Every level has past, present, and future variants on its theme song, and they all do really interesting things thematically with the instruments. There's actually a very strong sense of environmental storytelling in Sonic CD without any dialogue. Travel forward in time, and by default, you'll get a bad future, where the various regions of Little Planet are polluted, toxic wastelands, full of broken down factories where even Eggman's robots are in disrepair and completely non-threatening. Not even he wins when his plans succeed. But if you fix the past or get all the time zones, you're rewarded with good futures instead, which are lush, beautiful paradises that, interestingly, have not an absence of technology, but technology working in harmony with nature, all accompanied by beautifully heartwarming remixes of the level theme. I almost cried when I heard the Good Future theme for the final level. It sells both the environmentalist message and the idea that Sonic is a hero whose actions are making a difference. That said, in gameplay, I don't think it's quite as good as Sonic 2, but it is still way better than 1. In fact, the levels are almost stealth remakes of 1 in terms of their theme. You've got a grassy area, a bouncy pinball area, an aquatic ruin, and so on. But what I like about them mechanically is they can all be played for either speed or exploration. Most levels can be beaten in less than a minute if you know what you're doing, or you can find the time post and explore the past and future. In fact, there's 2 different paths to the good ending. Either you focus on getting the time stones in special stages and don't need to do any exploring, or you travel to the past and hunt down all the robot generators. This also gives CD a lot of replay value, especially in Origins Plus, where all 4 characters are playable here. For some reason, Knuckles in CD was not a thing in regular Origins. Oh, CD also had the first appearance of Metal Sonic, and I see why the Metal Sonic race is so iconic among fans who grew up with this. It is one of the best boss fights in the series, and maybe even in all gaming. I ultimately give Sonic CD a 4.5 out of 5. I feel nostalgic for it, even though I never played it as a child. But I acknowledge that it's not my objective favourite of the collection. That would be Sonic 2, which I gave a 5 out of 5. Sonic 2 is taking all the good levels of Sonic 1 and making that the whole game. It's that simple. The moment that I first played Chemical Plant, I knew I was going to love this game. You can go so fast, you nearly outrun the camera. And this came out in 1992, by the way. There are some slower, more platform-focused levels, but they do feel a lot less slow than those in Sonic 1. Aquatic Ruin is what Labyrinth Zone should have been. And yes, Metropolis Zone is utterly evil, but it's still fun in a sadistic way. I also really like Wing Fortress and wish that level returned in future games. You have to navigate the outside of a giant airship, dodging turbines, grabbing onto support struts, and using gun hatches as platforms. This is also the first Sonic game to feature another playable character, in this case debuting Tails, but it's hard to rank him because this version backports his flying in from later games. In the original Genesis version, Tails could only fly as an AI, and I imagine that would be very awkward. Something I also love about Sonic 2 is, it's the perfect length for firing up a run on the Switch on the go. You can beat the whole game in an hour or less, and I've played through this one easily the most of this collection. It's also, as of now, the only one that I've beaten on Classic Lives mode. I can definitely see why it defines so many childhoods. And now, probably my hot take of this collection, Sonic 3 and Knuckles I only give a 4.5 out of 5. I sum up this game as big. It was so big, one cartridge couldn't contain it. This version combines Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles, which were originally separate games, into one. So you get a lot of levels here, but also very long levels. In my view though, bigger doesn't always mean better, and I actually feel 3 and Knuckles is too ambitious for its own good. This game has a surprising amount of story in it. There's still no dialogue, but there's a lot of sequences in levels that essentially amount to unskippable cutscenes. And they can get jarring on replays, especially when you have to sit through them every time you die. And yes, there are a lot of very, very good levels here. I love Hydro City, Ice Cap Act 2, Mushroom Hill's really good, Flying Battery is great, Lava Reef has great music. There are some levels that I think overstay their welcome, and how I sum this up is the time bonus. The way that's scored doesn't change much from Sonic 1, CD, and 2, so beating a level in over 5 minutes is considered too slow. That was reasonable in those games, but here, you're likely to exceed 5 minutes on a first playthrough of most levels, and in some of the levels, the original version's 10-minute death timer is a real threat. I'm looking at you, Sandopolis Act 2. One thing where the cinematic flair really works though is the boss fights. My jaw dropped when I got to the Marble Garden boss, where you're actually carried by Tails fighting an Eggman mech in the sky. Also, Knuckles has his own campaign with slightly different levels and a completely original final boss. This was probably a precursor to the adventure games. Still an excellent game, but I prefer 2 and CD slightly more. One thing I have to mention is that this version of Sonic 3 and Knuckles had to cut a few songs that were probably composed by Michael Jackson and therefore have legal issues. Now, they were replaced with tracks from the beta version that always existed, but the original tracks for Ice Cap and Carnival Night were very iconic, so it's sad to have them gone. Origins has its own additional features though, besides making all 4 characters playable in all games, and Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy each have their own strengths and weaknesses, just like the modern 3D entries. They also added boss rushes, mirror mode, and some short challenges, which remind me of the challenge acts in Generations. Oh yeah, technically I have 12 Game Gear games via Origins Plus, but I haven't played them yet, and from what I hear, I'm not missing much. From the perspective of somebody who never played the older Sonic games, this was a good way to experience them, especially portably via the Switch. In fact, I never once played this dot. By averaging the score of all 4 games, I give it a 4 out of 5, though, like I said at the start, I recommend getting the Plus version on sale, rather than paying full price. Let's take a break from the Sonic BrainRot for an unexpected highlight of my year. I expected Reload to be good, I expected Metaphor to be good, but the announcement of an updated re-release for Shin Megami Tensei 5 left me skeptical. I have an entire video on why I felt the original missed the mark in a lot of ways, and I was not confident that a simple re-release could fix everything wrong. Plus, I get the frustration with Atlus's updated re-release model. It sucks to pay full price for a game, only for the real version of the game to come out a few years later. Given interviews, this is likely the last time Atlus will do this. They'll be using DLCs in the future, and I really hope this is true. But anyway, my expectations going into Vengeance were very, very low. I thought I'd like the canon of Vengeance story more, only because it was a very, very low bar to clear. What I was not expecting was that Shin Megami Tensei 5 was only a few little changes away from becoming not only a candidate for best Shin Megami Tensei game, but one of the greatest JRPGs ever made? I give Vengeance a 5 out of 5, simple as that. The gameplay didn't change all that much, and it didn't really need to. Gameplay was already the biggest strength, and possibly only strength, of Vanilla 5. What they did do, though, was remove the level scaling. In the original, being significantly lower level than the target made you do vastly less damage, and vice versa for being significantly higher level. That is completely gone, and it changes everything. Now, movesets and strategy matter way more than raw levels. I was overjoyed when I found that I could beat enemies and bosses 20 levels above me with the right demons and the right movesets. Conversely, when you're overleveled, the endgame bosses are no longer a joke. The final boss, previously more of a victory lap, actually made me think this time. And the boss itself is fundamentally unchanged. Removing level scaling from the damage formula just affects that much. There's also some fun new additions for team building, like demons having passive skills similar to Persona 5 Royal's traits. I've seen people discover combos that do hilarious things to the super bosses. My one gripe with combat is that Magatsuhi's skills are still a bit awkward. All of the ones besides critical are actually very good, especially at high level play against the super bosses, but all Magatoki critical will get you through 99.9% of the main story, so you're never incentivized to learn the other ones. Now the part you're waiting for, the story. I originally said you didn't have to compare this story to Persona 5 to realize it had no heart. Well, guess what? Shin Megami Tensei 5's story has heart now. What's kinda cool is the original plot is still available via Canon of Creation. I don't recommend checking that out unless you're very curious though, because Vengeance is so much better. Creation's human characters and even some of its alignment reps were so boring I often forgot their names. In Vengeance, I actually feel emotions towards these people. Granted, the changes don't really start until the second Dart region, but the conflict feels so much more personal. It feels like you're fighting with a group of friends for an actual cause now, rather than being press-ganged into a war the Angels already lost. When big world-shaking events happened, especially the ending of the third arc, I actually cared. Yuzu had the biggest glow-up by far. Many people have described him as, oh hey, he's an actual character this time. He has goals, a friendly dynamic with Dazai, his relationship with his sister is more expanded on, he has a nice master-student, almost father-son dynamic with Koshimizu, and so what he goes through in the story made me feel things. Tao, previously the only interesting human character by default, now has an actual arc about coming into her own and learning to stand up for herself. And while her role in the final arc is mostly the same as on Creation, it's a lot more personal, now that you get to know her more as an actual person until then. Of course, you can't talk about Tao without her chaotic, newly added foil Yoko, and initially I just thought Yoko was a bit of a meme edgelord, who more existed to facilitate Tao's development than to be a character in her own right. But I was surprised at how much my opinion shifted once I got to the end of the third arc. Yoko was very much not that. She had her own arc and own struggles, and it was interesting. Though I'd appreciate if she didn't disappear from the plot between the end of the third arc and the final confrontation. Wish we had more time to get to know her in a certain way, let's just say. Though speaking of confrontations, the Kadishtu are also amazing because they give the story a consistent group of antagonists, something it sorely needed before. They also replace a couple of minor plot irrelevant bosses from Creation. The existence of the Kadishtu also retroactively makes Yakumo and Nua's philosophy a lot less dumb, because now we see demons actively meddling with and harming humans, just as they argue. See, there were the seeds of a good story in Creation, and it only took a subtle push to make them grow. My only issue with the Vengeance story, and this is vaguely a spoiler, but the one character that was done dirty was Abdiel. I appreciated them at least trying to make a more nuanced lore angel in Creation, and let's just say they stripped all of that out in Vengeance in favor of making her a straight villain, which works, but it still feels like they kinda gave up. Speaking of which though, one of my highest praises for Canon of Vengeance is, it's got a lore ending and a chaos ending, and they're both genuinely good. They both have their pros and cons, and neither feels too extreme compared to the other. In summary, Vengeance is less a re-release and more the discovery of a phenomenal game formerly trapped in a shell of its true self. Wow, that's pretentious. Did I really write that? Basically, it might be a re-release, but it's one of the best games of 2024. One Christmas as a teen, I had a choice of either Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door or Metroid Prime 2, and I picked the latter. And so I was never able to play the game that was many's favourite of all time, until the power of remakes. For many years, I'd been actively avoiding this game just because of how hyped it was by its fans. I thought I was inevitably going to be disappointed. But I mellowed out, and playing it myself, I can understand why people think this is the best Mario RPG, or even the best Mario game. Simple to learn but hard to master sums up the battle system. It's turn-based, but the numbers are very small. Any defense stat above 0 is very notable, and 10 damage is massive. But being able to pick your stats on level ups, over 80 badges that either modify abilities or give new ones, multiple partners each with a lot of moves and upgrades that give them even more, and new star powers that unlock every chapter. And that's not even getting into items, which are genuinely useful in this game, and I like that they throw some high defense enemies at you early to demonstrate that. There's even a multi-layered risk versus reward guard system. You can do a regular guard to be guaranteed to reduce damage, or press a different button to try a super guard, which if timed correctly will negate all damage and damage the enemy, but if timed wrong, you take all the damage. There's even a front row and back row system. But not only are regular battles fun, every chapter ends on an epic and incredibly fun boss battle, usually with a villain that's built up over the course of the story. And the best part is that every end of chapter boss has a unique boss theme. This is something that Paper Mario's always done, even in the weirder installments, and it's one of my favourite parts of it. There are ways to break the game, though some have been nerfed from the original, but it's not trivial challenge-wise. I was mostly going for BP, and I found my lack of HP a real problem in the endgame. The final boss actually gave me a rough time. Despite all that, Thousand Year Door seems to be more remembered for its story, and also for good reasons. The dialogue writing is incredible, the characters are all great, Peach and Bowser especially are on point here, but every chapter is set in a memorable, unique location that has its own subplot, with a very well-written supporting cast, especially the partners. There's a reason they're all fan favourites. It's proof that a simple plot can be carried by great writing and characters, because the main story is basically Peach gets kidnapped by a group trying to take over the world, but the parts that make up the sum are what really sells this. I love the game's presentation too. Apparently the Switch version runs at a lower frame rate, but this is made up for by the gorgeous papercraft graphics and amazing music. You can even switch back to the original soundtrack, but I'd never want to because they gave every chapter its own variant of the battle theme, and chapters 6 and 7 are particularly incredible. And a subtle but great detail, every boss, even mini-bosses, have their own victory music too. I don't think this game is perfect, however, and the main reason is the Trouble Center. I just don't find these side quests very engaging. Most of them boil down to backtrack to the previous chapter's area, get an item, backtrack to another chapter's area, give that item to someone, and your rewards are usually just a handful of coins. There's one or two quests that reveal things about the NPC lore, but personally, the most interesting side activities are the ones that aren't tied to the Trouble Center. Hearing Luigi's stories, and paying an informant to learn the lore of Rogueport. One of my other gripes is a badge called Quick Change, which lets you swap partners without using a turn. This effect opens the battle system so much that there's few playthroughs that don't use it, and at that point, you might as well make it a standard feature of the gameplay and not an optional badge. The remake added a couple of great super bosses, along with a convenient fast travel system to all of the chapter locations, which I dread to think how bad the Trouble Center was without this. But I have heard horror stories. Overall, I gave this game a 4 out of 5. It's an incredible game. I guess I just missed out on having nostalgia for it, but I'm very glad they brought this back, and combined with Brothership, I hope this convinces Nintendo to revive Mario RPGs. Now here's a game you might not expect on this list. I haven't finished this yet on account of being distracted by Metaphor, but I've played enough to give my general thoughts, and they're pretty positive. I've been wanting to play Ys 8 for a long time, and I finally got it on sale. This sounds familiar? Ys is an action RPG series, and Falcom's other flagship besides Trails. Like Trails, it's set in one continuous narrative, but unlike Trails, each game is self-contained and presented out of chronological order. The premise is the protagonist, Adol, is a legendary adventurer who lived until his 60s, and every game is an excerpt from his memoirs. This is, in my opinion, even smarter than Trails because it gives the developers an excuse to make as many games about Adol as they want. They can just jump between any point in his timeline. It also means you can play the games in any order because, again, each one is a self-contained chapter of his life. Ys 8 centers around Adol being shipwrecked on an island and needing to band together with a group of castaways to survive, while witnessing flashbacks to the island's mysterious past. To go into Sonic BrainRot again, this game is basically if you got to play as Tikal in the flashbacks of Sonic Adventure and she was awesome. As an action RPG, this game is deceptively simple. There are no real combos, just one basic attack button and specials that you can map to other buttons. And battles appear to just be hit things until they die, but there's a lot of depth, I assure you. Mainly via the flash move and flash guard features. By pressing either dodge or block the exact moment an attack hits you, you get temporary invincibility and another effect, increase move and attack speed for flash move, and auto crits on all your attacks for flash guard. You can also do both at the same time. The combat is about knowing which of your moves are the best for which situation, and learning the enemy's attack patterns and how to best dodge or flash guard them. So, more strategy than stun-locking things with combos, and that's my kind of jam. There's also a good variety of playable characters who can seamlessly swap between on the fly. What truly drew me into this game though is just how refreshingly unique it was for an RPG due to its premise and setting. This isn't a war to take down an evil empire or church, this is just a bunch of people struggling to band together and survive in a hostile wilderness. In fact, the vast majority of the plot has no villain. And there's a great sense of community as you bring more castaways into the village and they run their own ramshackle shops. And fittingly, the game has no money system. Everything is traded for with monster parts. There's also a surprising genre blending going on here. Not only is it an action RPG, it's also kind of a Metroidvania. You've got a lot of freedom to explore the island, but you'll often run into obstacles you can only get past by either recruiting specific castaways, recruiting a certain number in total, or finding an item that gives you a new ability. You have to periodically defend your village from monster raids in a kind of tower defense game, which later gets expanded to a territory control game with hunting raids. The flashbacks feel similar to games like Zelda Oracle of Ages, where your actions in the past affect the present. And without spoiling much, there's even more. Just when I thought the game couldn't add any new mechanics, it did. This continued for a surprising length of time. And this isn't some haphazard blend of genres either. Every new addition felt like a natural extension of what came before. I'm really excited to get back to this game and finish it. Look forward to my full review on Backlogged once I'm out of metaphor BRAINROT. Did somebody say BRAINROT? Yes, I can finally cover Sonic Frontiers. Now, I did stream all of this game on the channel, so my thoughts are contained in most of that, and I had a lot of fun there. I recommend watching those VODs. But to sum up the game as a whole, I'd call it a game that by all rights should not work, yet somehow does. I should also mention though, just like Origins, I played this game after every patch, and just like Origins, I heard this game was significantly worse before the patches, and I don't want to encourage that mentality in game development, so it's hard to rate this. But after all the patches, it's a very good experience. But my thoughts on it are a little weird due to my unique perspective. You see, I hated what Breath of the Wild did to Zelda, despite it being a good game in its own right. Frontiers is one of the many games that clearly takes inspiration from it, and I'm totally fine with it. In fact, this is the one open world game that I tolerate, and the main reason is Sonic himself. You see, why I dislike open world games is the majority of your time spent playing is not actually spent playing. It's just spent in a walking simulator, going from point A to point B between landmarks, looking at pretty scenery, while the game is constantly bombarding you with tiny menial distractions. This is mostly true of Frontiers, except that you're playing as Sonic the freaking Hedgehog, and the very act of walking is the fun of the gameplay. Let's just say, Frontiers requires you to go out of your way to unlock fast travel for every island, and I don't even mind, because Sonic is the fast travel system. I can get from one side of an island to the other in less than a minute, and I'm having fun all the way. I also like how Sonic controls in Frontiers, and this seems to be a bit of a hot take. Air boosting and stomping are great tools for correcting overshot jumps. You have a double jump, believe me, I'll rant about that in the Generation section, and moving in 3D just feels smoother than it does in most Sonic. The boost does lack a bit of oomph in cyberspace, I will admit, but I like that it no longer damages enemies. You now need to think of it more as a movement tool than as just mindlessly boost to win. But if you don't like the controls or physics, patches have you covered with a ridiculous number of sliders that let you customize the experience to be exactly what you want. So the core gameplay loop of Frontiers: you complete mini platforming challenges in the overworld to get memory tokens, which you use to talk to Sonic's friends and progress the story. Defeat mini-bosses in the overworld to collect portal gears, which opens cyberspace levels. Cyberspace levels give you vault keys, which you use to get Chaos Emeralds in the overworld. You need 6, the boss has the 7th, to unlock the boss of each island and proceed to the next one. This setup works well, but I have 2 issues. First, there are hundreds more memory tokens on each island than you need. I don't mind the mini platforming challenges, but they could have cut a lot of these without affecting the experience. I did go for 100% memory tokens on my first playthrough, but I'm probably not going to do that again. Second, and most pressingly, however, all those items I mentioned, those methods aren't the only way to get them. You can also buy them in Big's fishing minigame, which I don't have that much of a problem with, or just get them randomly by side-looping in place. Literally 0 efforts. I'm all for optional ways to get through the game faster, but this side loop thing essentially lets you opt out of playing the game. In fact, when I did Final Horizon, I never needed to play any of its cyberspace levels. I got enough Lookout Coco from just randomly side looping. Speaking of which, cyberspace. I like this a lot more than most people do. These are all short Sonic Generations style levels, most of them have an S-rank time of less than a minute, that you play to get vault keys. I originally found their level designs very fun, but that's because I hadn't played a Sonic game in 10 years, and so didn't realize they were reused from earlier games. Even then, I don't notice this that much, and I still find them fun. I do admit though, the lack of theming on these levels does get old after a while. The best you get is them changing up the time of day. The other thing that kinda bothers me is that S ranks are purely time-based. Different people like different things in Sonic rank systems, and I like it when it's mostly about time, but when a little of other things matters. There are other objectives, they're just separate to getting S ranks. Outside of cyberspace, Sonic has a stylish action-style combat system against enemies. There's a lot of flashy moves to learn, but strategic use of them is rarely encouraged. The best I found was using ranged attacks on shielded enemies before they put their shields up. Also, the parry system lacks the depth it was likely intended to have. In the main story, you can just hold down the button to be guaranteed to parry everything, while in the DLC, they added time parries, but only the new final boss's attacks were designed with this in mind, and every other boss becomes a complete nightmare. Also, you're very likely to max the skill tree within your first hour, and then be stuck with useless experience points for the rest of the game. The problem with all this is the combat is a necessary evil, because if you didn't have it, there wouldn't be any build-up to the Titan fights at the end of each island, and those are amazing. There's a reason they've kinda gone viral. Every one of them could be a final boss in any other Sonic game. And the thing I love about the way Super Sonic is used here is that instead of being a flying win button, he can do everything regular Sonic can do, just turned up to 11, which means the bosses truly test your knowledge of what came before. I normally dislike flashy quick-time event sequences, but here they work. These fights are basically a playable shonen anime, and the music makes them even better. Sonic is known for having great soundtracks, and Frontiers might be one of the best, which is really saying something. A friend of mine makes a joke that this game's soundtrack budget must have just been yes, because there's somehow over 20 vocal tracks. And when it comes to other gameplay issues, the main story has a very underwhelming finale. They clearly ran out of time, and the last island is a reskin of the first with a very disappointing final boss. Thankfully, they added a free DLC expansion that gives a much better ending and final boss, and adds 3 new fully playable characters. The downside is this DLC expansion is incredibly hard, and that might be frustrating for some. Just be warned when you're going into it. There's no shame switching to easy if you need to. But Frontiers isn't just notable for redefining Sonic gameplay, but also Sonic stories. This marks renowned Sonic comic writer Ian Flynn's first time writing full dialogue for a main Sonic game. He previously did Origins cutscenes, but they were silent. Ian Flynn is both an incredible writer and a massive Sonic fan, and this can be a double-edged sword for some people because he can be a bit heavy-handed with references, but the advantage is he really gets these characters. I'd say Frontiers has less of a story and more lore and character development. Amy, Knuckles, and Tails each undergo arcs that spin their history of inconsistent writing across the franchise into natural, slow-burn character progression. Frontiers made me fall in love with these characters all over again, and that's very high praise. I also want to give a shout out to how subtly emotive Sonic is in these cutscenes. Even though they're all in-engine, his body language is very well done. You get the sense that Amy, Knuckles, and Tails each mean something very different to him, but by showing it rather than outright telling. Overall, I talked about this game way more than I should have, but it deserves it. This game broke the Sonic cycle, miraculously. And things have been looking pretty good for the franchise, but like I said earlier, this is Sonic, so please don't screw it up. And to finish up the Sonic Brainrot just in time for the third movie, we have Shadow Generations. While billed as a remaster of Generations with an additional side campaign, it's more like its own totally new game that just happens to come with a free remaster of Generations. Similar to Bowser's Fury. The Shadow portion is quite substantial, with 6 big levels with 2 acts each, lots of challenge acts, and a large overworld with tons of collectibles. It's also essentially Sonic Team's experiment in taking lessons from Frontiers into a more traditional modern 3D Sonic. The open world stuff is relegated to the hub area and less extreme on collectibles than Frontiers, while the actual levels take cues from how Sonic controlled in Frontiers, including giving Shadow a double jump. But the real highlight is the level design. This very much feels like a modern take on Sonic Adventure 2's level design philosophy, which many fans have wanted for years. The levels have wider, more open segments, with branching paths a little more subtle than pick one of 3 lanes. They're also all around 5 minutes long with multiple set pieces. As for Shadow himself, they finally did what I always wanted and differentiated his gameplay from Sonic's without using guns or vehicles. Chaos Spear and Chaos Control of movement tools that are fun to play around with, and then you have all the Doom powers on top of that. The boss fights are also great and make creative use of these powers. But there's also more subtle aspects of Shadow's moveset that I really like, such as his homing attack being a teleport that goes through walls, which has creative uses once you realise this. If I have any gripes apart from the game being over too soon, it's that unlike Frontiers, collectibles don't show on the map until you've moved past them, and the hub world is a lot more intricate and layered than you would think, so this makes going for 100% a bit of a pain. As for the story, I won't spoil too much, but I'll just say that 2024 has truly delivered in its promise of being the year of Shadow. The 2010s wrote Shadow as just an edgelord rival, essentially a parody of how the fanbase saw him back then. It's only now that SEGA is really opening up and letting writers actually explore his grief and backstory in real depth, and letting him display emotions besides contempt. Though he still does that a lot. There's also some great lore reveals in Gerald's journal, and a few surprise character appearances in the hub world. If you like Shadow, you'll probably enjoy this story. I admit I am not the biggest fan of him in general, and as a result, the collectible gallery isn't really for me since it's almost entirely Shadow themed. But again, it's nice for his fans. And now to touch on the Generations portion. This used to be the uncontested best 3D Sonic, though the competition wasn't high at the time. But going back over 10 years later, does it hold up? Mostly. Having played Frontiers, I do feel like modern Sonic's controls are a little stiff. They're fine in the 2D segments, but when you get to 3D, especially when you need to make precise movements to get red rings, it gets a little janky. You also really miss the double jump when going from Shadow Story. But the level design is still great, and there's a really good variety in environments. That's one issue I have with Shadow's campaign. Almost all of those areas are hyper-realistic cities or ruins. Besides a couple of conveniences like being able to turn off lives and running really well on Switch, even portably, it's mostly the same game as the original, except in one area, and this was something that not a lot of people expected. I was hoping they'd make some minor touch-ups to cutscenes, like Sonic no longer shoving away Amy's face in the opening, but I wasn't expecting a complete rewrite of the script, and I'm mostly okay with this, with a couple of exceptions. So the thing you have to know is the original Generations was written during what fans call the meta era of Sonic. Video game critics and the internet were not treating the franchise seriously, so SEGA thought, well then, we won't either. As a result, the original Generations script focused more on joking about what the players experienced in past eras of Sonic.
And that pink water makes me really nervous for some reason.
Rather than what the characters would logically think about seeing their past again.
This is definitely the chemical plant, but we're not remotely on West Side Island. Did that monster do this?
And treated all the characters besides the Sonics and Tailses as one-note jokes. Except Blaze, I guess, she's always cool. The touched-up script focuses a lot more on streamlining the series' lore and continuity, and treating the characters with a lot more respect. Making it feel like Sonic is actually friends with them and them with him. And for the most part, this is good. My only issues are losing the pink water and the will I really get that crazy jokes, which were admittedly very funny meta references. Some of these line changes are also notable because they didn't touch up the cutscenes visually to match. For example, the camera still pans to the water even though Tails no longer references it, outside of the Japanese script where he does. And most infamously, there's this.
Thanks, Sonic. Now then, tell me, where is the rest of my island?
I ate it. I do think there's more good than bad in the revised script overall. One final thing to mention is that I'm playing this game on Switch, and the remaster of Generations runs incredibly well. Consistent 30 frames per second when it didn't do that in the PS3, and graphics just barely worse than modern gen consoles. However, the Shadow Generations portion does look considerably worse on Switch. Though it's important to note that it still plays well. There is no stuttering or frame drops, and while it is 30 frames per second, I don't even notice, and even the PS4 version of Shadow Gens is 30 FPS. You'll just want to play a different version if you like visuals, but get the Switch version if you want portability. And of course, there's Metaphor ReFantazio, which is my game of the year this year, but I'm going to do an entire video on that. Before I end this, I do want to talk about one game that I started this year but was not able to finish. And I left this until now because it's a bit negative and a massive hot take. In my turn-based JRPG kick earlier this year, I also got Octopath Traveller 2, as I'd heard good things about it, and I played the demo and kinda liked it. Unfortunately, even though this is a game that has got widespread praise from JRPG fans on the internet, I didn't end up enjoying it. The characters, voice acting, and especially music are all incredible, but I lost interest in the game after completing everybody's second chapters for reasons I find it hard to explain. Likely the biggest reason is that I really dislike this game's art style, which, as I said before, is a massive hot take. I'm sorry, but I think this game looks horrible, especially on a big screen TV. As far as HD 2D goes, I vastly prefer the Dragon Quest III remake. My other theory is I feel keeping track of 8 storylines overcrowds my brain. This is the only JRPG where I never cared about doing a single side quest, because my mind's already too full keeping track of everything else. And thirdly, the battle system didn't click with me. I've realized recently that I don't like break mechanics in RPGs. They don't feel like they added much to the gameplay loop tactically. Then there's the burst system, which feels similar to Bravely Default's Brave and Default mechanic, except there, it's much more interesting because you're actually taking an advance on your turns and potentially putting your turns into negative for later, whereas here it's just wait and then you get to attack 4 times, or once really hard with a special move. Though I did enjoy the abilities that moved around BP. Having watched speedruns though, Octopath's gameplay feels very similar to an aspect of Bravely Default's battle system that I also didn't like. And that is that it feels like you're either really struggling, or you discover the broken build and are so powerful that you one-shot bosses before they get a turn. And there doesn't seem to be a real in-between. And unlike Persona, Shin Megami Tensei, and Fire Emblem, I can't grasp the logic behind the optimal builds here. Octopath 2 is a game that I'm sure is very good, it's just not for me, and so I refuse to review or give it a rating, because I can't really do that fairly. And that's it, those are the games I played in 2024. Surely 2025 will not be dominated by Sonic BRAINROT, oh wait, the movie, and also I bought all 3 Sonic Advances in Japan. There also aren't a lot of future releases I'm looking forward to right now, besides the Okami sequel and Trails in the Sky remake. So the start of 2025 is likely going to be occupied by me playing games in my backlog. And I've got a lot of good stuff here. So look forward to hearing all about that, and look forward to what's on my channel next year. Until then, thank you very much for a great 2024, and I'll see you all in whatever I do next.